If you were looking at a map of the world in 1941, things looked, well, pretty grim for the Allies. I mean, you had Nazi Germany, this absolute behemoth, just swallowing Europe whole. And at the same time, Imperial Japan was tearing through the Pacific at a terrifying speed. It really felt like the Axis powers were completely unstoppable. But as we all know, history had a major plot twist in store. So that's the big question, right? How on earth did the Allies pull it back from the absolute brink of defeat? Well, it wasn't just one thing. It wasn't one magic bullet. It was actually a series of incredibly dramatic, world-shaking moments that flipped the entire script on the war. And that's exactly what we're going to dive into. We're going to pinpoint those exact moments, that handful of absolutely crucial turning points, where the Allies basically snatched victory from the jaws of defeat and completely shifted the momentum of the entire war. Okay, so first, let's just take a moment to really understand how dominant the Axis powers were. We're talking Germany, Italy, and Japan, who had signed this thing called the Tripartite Pact. It was a seriously formidable alliance that basically dared the rest of the world to do anything about it. And by 1941, man, they were at the absolute height of their power. And you really can't see this dominance any clearer than on the Eastern Front. So in June 1941, Hitler launches Operation Barbarossa. And just look at this timeline. The speed of the advance is just staggering. The Germans were masters of these huge encircling movements, trapping hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers at a time. I mean, nearly 700,000 in the battle for Kiev alone. It's wild. And by December, they weren't just deep in Russia. They were literally at the gates of Moscow. The scale of this thing, it's almost impossible to wrap your head around. We're talking 3 million Axis soldiers pouring into the Soviet Union. And Stalin, even though he'd been warned by both Roosevelt and Churchill, had left his country totally unprepared. It was, and it still is, the largest ground invasion in all of human history. Just think about that for a second. So while all of this is going down in Russia, halfway across the globe, Japan is kicking off its own massive, ambitious plan. The surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, that was all about knocking the U.S. Pacific Fleet out of the fight in one go. The idea was to give Japan a free hand to conquer Southeast Asia and all its valuable resources. And, at first, it worked like a charm. They just swept through places like Guam, the Philippines, Singapore. They were even threatening Australia and India. So by early 1942, the picture is pretty clear. The Axis controls this huge chunk of the planet. But you know how these stories go. So often, your greatest strength becomes your greatest weakness. And for the Axis, that strength was this absolute belief that they were invincible. And that, well, that was about to become a major problem for them. The first cracks started to show, and they were born from pure arrogance. And this quote, it just says it all, doesn't it? Hitler was so sure he'd win quickly that he didn't even bother to supply his army with winter gear. So when that legendary, brutal Russian winter hit, oil was literally freezing inside their trucks and tanks. His generals were begging him, let us dig in, let us wait for spring. And Hitler's response, no, keep going. It was a completely catastrophic mistake, especially against an enemy that was nowhere near beaten. Okay, so this is it. This is where the tide really starts to turn. We're going to look at 3 massive, decisive battles, each in a different part of the world, that together, they really spelled the beginning of the end for the Axis powers. First up, Stalingrad. Hitler became obsessed with taking the city named after his rival, Stalin. He just threw his elite 6th Army right into a meat grinder of urban warfare. But here's the incredible part. While the Germans were getting bogged down in this brutal street-by-street fighting, the Soviets were pulling off something amazing. They had literally taken apart more than 1,500 of their factories, put them on trains, and moved them east, way out of reach of the German army. Just an insane industrial feat. And so, with brand new tanks and planes coming off these new assembly lines, they launched this giant pincer movement, and boom, they trapped the entire German 6th Army. Hitler, of course, refused to let them retreat. The result? An absolute unmitigated disaster for Germany. Now, at almost the exact same time the tide is turning in the frozen ruins of Stalingrad, another huge battle is going down half a world away in the Pacific. The Japanese Navy, still riding high and feeling invincible, comes up with a plan to lure the last few American carriers into a trap at Midway Island to finish them off for good. But there was a catch. U.S. codebreakers had cracked the Japanese naval codes. They knew the attack was coming. The result was a jaw-dropping reversal of fortune. The U.S. Navy sinks four of Japan's best and most vital aircraft carriers. It was a blow the Japanese fleet would never ever recover from. All right, so the third part of this massive shift happened in a totally different place, the deserts of North Africa. For a long time, it was this back-and-forth slugfest, but then the British finally scored a huge, decisive victory against Rommel, the Desert Fox, at a place called El Alamein. You combine that with brand-new American troops landing in the west, and suddenly you've got this giant vice that just squeezes the rest of the German and Italian forces completely out of the continent. So, with the momentum finally on their side, the Allies started to tighten that vice. See, the wins at Stalingrad, Midway, and in North Africa, they weren't just about stopping the Axis. No, they were springboards. They were the launching pads for massive counteroffensives aimed right at the Axis homelands. Okay, so Africa is secure. Where do you go next? Well, Winston Churchill had an idea. He famously called Italy Europe's soft underbelly, and that's exactly where they went. Allied forces landed in Sicily, and that invasion pretty quickly led to Mussolini getting booted from power and eventually to Italy surrendering. But of course, the main event, the one everyone was waiting for, was the invasion of France, D-Day. I mean, the scale of this operation is just almost impossible to comprehend. It starts with this massive bombing from the air and sea. Then you have paratroopers dropping behind enemy lines. And then the beach assault. Over 150,000 Allied soldiers hitting the beaches of Normandy all at once. The casualties, especially on Omaha Beach, were just horrific. But the landings worked. They succeeded. And in doing so, they ripped open that all-important Western Front. And from that moment on, you can just picture the Axis being squeezed from every direction. In Europe, Germany is now stuck in its worst nightmare. A massive war on two fronts, with the Allies in the west and the Soviets in the east. At the same time, in the Pacific, U.S. forces under guys like MacArthur and Nimitz are deep into this brutal island-hopping campaign. And we're not talking about one big front, we're talking about a whole series of incredibly punishing bloody fights on these tiny, heavily fortified islands, places like Guadalcanal and Tarawa. Every single island was another stepping stone, paid for with incredible sacrifice to get closer and closer to Japan itself. And this all brings us to the end game, the final act. That vice getting tighter and tighter, and the Axis powers are starting to collapse. But the end of this war was going to be just as brutal as the beginning. And as it turns out, it would set the stage for a totally new kind of global conflict. So, in one last desperate gamble, Hitler throws everything he has left into a surprise attack through the Ardennes forest. This creates what we now call the Battle of the Bulge. For a minute, it looks bad. He even manages to trap some American forces in the town of Bastogne. The Germans demand they surrender, and the American commander's now famous official reply was one word: nuts. I mean, that one word just perfectly captures the Allied resolve at that point. The gamble failed, and after that, the final collapse of Germany happened very, very quickly. Okay, so Germany is defeated, but a really terrible question still hangs over everything. The fighting in the Pacific, on islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa, had been on another level of brutal. Japanese soldiers were fighting to the very last man, almost never surrendering. So the Allies were asking themselves, how do we get Japan to surrender without a ground invasion that could cost millions of American and Japanese lives? They were looking at a truly unthinkable choice. Option A full-scale invasion of the Japanese home islands. The projected casualty numbers were staggering, potentially millions of lives lost on both sides. Then there was option B, use this brand new, terrifying weapon that had just been successfully tested out in the New Mexico desert. The hope was it would be such a shock to the system that it would force the Japanese leadership to finally surrender. And as we all know, President Truman went with option B. On August 6, 1945, the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. When Japan still didn't surrender, a second was dropped on Nagasaki 3 days later. The devastation was just immense. On September 2nd, the Emperor of Japan went on the radio and announced the country's unconditional surrender. The Second World War was finally over. In the aftermath, well, Germany was carved up and divided between the victors. Japan was occupied by the Allies. The single most destructive conflict in all of human history had come to an end. But the world that rose from those ashes was a fundamentally different place. It had been changed forever. And that really brings us to the final lingering thought here. The war basically left two huge superpowers standing on the world stage, the United States and the Soviet Union. But that alliance they had during the war? It crumbled almost immediately because of their completely different ideologies. And so the big question that would hang over the entire planet for the next half-century was a simple one. What happens when the allies of yesterday become the enemies of tomorrow?